The wind howled through the broken shutters of the bakery, carrying with it the scent of ash and loss. Cheryl Miller pressed her back against the cold stone wall, her heart hammering as heavy boots approached the front door. Through the cracked window, she could see the silhouette of a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his face hidden beneath the brim of a weathered hat. In his hand, something glinted in the pale moonlight. "I know you're in there," came the deep voice, rough as gravel. "We need to talk about what happened to your husband." Cheryl's breath caught in her throat. 3 weeks had passed since Carl Rivera's funeral. 3 weeks since the town had whispered their suspicions about the fire that claimed both her bakery and her husband's life. Now this stranger stood at her door, and she knew with terrible certainty that her fragile world was about to shatter completely. The door creaked open without invitation, and the man stepped inside. In the dim light filtering through the damaged roof, she could see his face clearly for the first time. Weathered skin, dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets, and a scar running from his left temple to his jaw. This was Kevin Morgan, the man the townspeople spoke of in hushed tones, the one they said could make problems disappear for the right price. "Name your price for one evening together," he said quietly, his voice carrying an unexpected gentleness. "One evening, and I'll tell you the truth about what really happened that night. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments." 6 months earlier, Cheryl Miller had been the happiest woman in Cedar Falls. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Miller's bakery, illuminating the golden loaves of bread, cooling on wooden racks. The scent of cinnamon and yeast filled the air, mingling with the sound of her husband Carl's laughter as he kneaded dough at the marble counter. "You're going to burn those biscuits if you keep staring at me like that," Carl teased, flour dusting his dark hair. Cheryl smiled, adjusting the temperature on the large brick oven. At 28, she had found the life she'd always dreamed of. The bakery was thriving. Their small apartment above the shop was filled with warmth and love, and Carl spoke often of the children they would have someday. Cedar Falls might have been a small frontier town, but it was their home, and they had built something beautiful together. "Mrs. Miller," called a voice from the front of the shop. Christina Sanders, the banker's wife, stood at the counter with her usual morning order. "2 loaves of your sourdough, please. My husband says it's the finest bread west of the Mississippi." "You flatter me, Mrs. Sanders," Cheryl replied, wrapping the warm loaves in brown paper, "though I suspect your husband is more interested in the extra butter I include with each purchase." The women laughed together, and Cheryl felt that familiar surge of contentment. This was her place in the world, surrounded by the simple pleasures of good work and kind neighbors. She had no way of knowing that in the shadows across the street, a man was watching, taking note of their routines, their customers, their small moments of happiness. That evening, as Cheryl and Carl cleaned the bakery and prepared for another day, neither noticed the figure that lingered in the alley behind their building. Kevin Morgan had been in Cedar Falls for 3 days, asking quiet questions, learning the rhythms of the town. He was a man who made his living in the spaces between law and lawlessness, and he had come to Cedar Falls on business that had nothing to do with bread or the young couple who made it. But as he watched Cheryl laugh at something her husband said, as he saw the way Carl's hand rested protectively on her shoulder, something stirred in him that he had thought long dead. It was a feeling he couldn't afford, not in his line of work, not with what he had been hired to do. The trouble began with a letter that arrived on a Tuesday morning in late autumn. Carl had gone to the post office to collect their mail, returning with a frown creasing his usually cheerful face. The envelope bore no return address, but the paper was expensive, the kind used by wealthy men who preferred their correspondence remain private. "What is it?" Cheryl asked, wiping her hands on her apron as she watched her husband read. Carl's face had gone pale. "It's about the loan," he said quietly, "the one we took to expand the bakery." Cheryl felt a chill that had nothing to do with the approaching winter. They had borrowed money from Gregory Gonzalez, a businessman from the territorial capital who had promised reasonable terms and patient repayment schedules. The expansion had been Carl's dream, a way to serve more customers and provide employment for other families in Cedar Falls. "What does he want?" she asked, though she feared the answer. "Full payment," Carl replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Within 30 days, or he'll take the bakery." The letter trembled in his hands as he read the rest. Gregory Gonzalez claimed that Carl had defaulted on payments, though they had been meticulous about sending money each month. He demanded not just the remaining balance, but additional fees and interest that would total more than twice what they had originally borrowed. "This can't be right," Cheryl said, moving to her husband's side. "We've never missed a payment. We have the receipts." But even as she spoke, she remembered the stories they had heard from other towns, other businesses that had dealings with men like Gonzalez. Loans that seemed fair at first, then became impossible burdens. Properties seized for manufactured defaults. Families left with nothing while wealthy men grew wealthier. That night, they sat at their small kitchen table, surrounded by ledgers and receipts, trying to make sense of numbers that refused to add up in their favor. Even if they sold everything they owned, they would still fall short of Gonzalez's demands. The bakery that had been their pride and joy was slipping away, and there seemed to be nothing they could do to stop it. "We'll fight this," Carl said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We'll find a lawyer, prove that we've met our obligations." Cheryl nodded, but she had seen the fear in her husband's eyes. They both knew that men like Gregory Gonzalez didn't make mistakes, didn't send threatening letters unless they were certain of their power to enforce them. The law was often a luxury that small-town bakers couldn't afford, especially when their opponents had money and influence. Outside their window, the first snow of the season began to fall, covering Cedar Falls in a blanket of white that made everything look clean and peaceful. But inside the apartment above Miller's Bakery, Cheryl and Carl held each other close and wondered if they would still have a home when spring came. They couldn't have known that in a hotel room across town, Kevin Morgan was reading a very different letter, one that contained detailed instructions about Carl Rivera and the bakery that would soon be his employer's property. The job was supposed to be simple: encourage the stubborn baker to accept reality, make him understand that fighting Gregory Gonzalez was futile. Kevin had handled similar assignments before, and they rarely required more than a stern conversation and a subtle display of force. But something about this job felt different. Perhaps it was the way the townspeople spoke of the Millers, the genuine affection in their voices when they described the young couple's kindness and hard work. Perhaps it was the memory of Cheryl's laughter, the way her face lit up when she spoke to customers. Kevin Morgan had spent years hardening his heart against such sentiments, but Cedar Falls was testing his resolve in ways he hadn't expected. As he prepared for sleep, Kevin found himself hoping that Carl Rivera would prove reasonable, that this business could be concluded without the kind of unpleasantness that sometimes became necessary. He had no way of knowing that fate had already set in motion events that would make such hopes impossible, that within weeks everything would change in ways that none of them could foresee. The confrontation came on a cold December morning when frost covered the bakery windows like delicate lace. Carl was arranging fresh loaves in the display case when the bell above the door chimed, announcing the arrival of two men who clearly didn't belong in Cedar Falls. Their clothes were expensive, their manner confident in the way of men accustomed to getting what they wanted. The first man was Tyler Peterson, Gregory Gonzalez's personal representative, a thin individual with pale eyes and soft hands that had never known honest labor. Behind him stood Lewis Reed, whose massive frame and scarred knuckles suggested he was present for reasons that had nothing to do with conversation. "Mr. Rivera," Tyler said, his voice carrying the artificial politeness of a man delivering an ultimatum, "I trust you received Mr. Gonzalez's correspondence regarding your outstanding debt." Carl straightened, wiping flour from his hands with deliberate slowness. Cheryl emerged from the back room, and Kevin Morgan, who had been watching from across the street, saw her face pale as she recognized the threat these men represented. "We've been making our payments," Carl said steadily. "Every month, exactly as agreed." Tyler smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "I'm afraid Mr. Gonzalez's records show otherwise. You currently owe $843, plus accumulated interest and penalties. Payment is due immediately." The sum was staggering, more money than the bakery could earn in 2 years. Cheryl felt the world tilt beneath her feet, but Carl stepped forward, his jaw set with determination. "That's not what we agreed to," he said. "The original loan was for $300, and we've already paid back nearly half of that amount." "Agreements can be reinterpreted," Tyler replied smoothly. especially when borrowers failed to read the fine print regarding variable interest rates and penalty clauses. From his position across the street, Kevin Morgan watched the scene unfold with growing unease. This wasn't the simple debt collection he had been hired to facilitate. This was theft, plain and simple, the kind of legal robbery that men like Gregory Gonzalez had perfected over years of preying on honest families. Lewis Reed stepped forward, his presence filling the small bakery like a storm cloud. "Mr. Gonzalez is a patient man," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But his patience has limits." Cheryl moved to her husband's side, her hand finding his arm. Kevin saw the gesture and felt something twist in his chest, a recognition of the love and loyalty that bound the couple together. It was the kind of connection he had never allowed himself, the kind of vulnerability that his profession made impossible. "We need time," Carl said. "Time to review the documents, to consult with someone who understands the law." Tyler's laugh was like the sound of ice cracking. "Time is a luxury you can't afford, Mr. Rivera. Mr. Gonzalez requires an answer today." The silence that followed was heavy with threat and possibility. Cheryl looked at her husband, seeing the defeat that was beginning to creep into his eyes. They both knew they were trapped, caught in a web of legal language and manufactured debt that would destroy everything they had built together. It was then that Kevin Morgan made a decision that would change all their lives. He had been hired to ensure Gregory Gonzalez got what he wanted, but watching Tyler Peterson's predatory smile and seeing the fear in Cheryl's eyes, he realized he couldn't be part of this particular cruelty. Instead of entering the bakery to add his intimidation to Louis Reed's, Kevin turned and walked away. It was a small act of rebellion, but it was the first crack in the wall he had built around his conscience. He didn't yet know what he would do to help the Millers, but he knew he couldn't help destroy them. That evening, as snow fell softly outside the bakery windows, Carl and Cheryl sat in their kitchen, holding each other while their world crumbled around them. They had sent Tyler Peterson away without an answer, buying themselves a few days at most before Gregory Gonzalez's patience ran out entirely. "Maybe we should just give them what they want," Cheryl whispered against her husband's shoulder. "Start over somewhere else." But Carl shook his head, his arms tightening around her. "This is our home," he said. "Our life. I won't let them steal it without a fight." The fire started just after midnight on the coldest night of the year. Cheryl woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of Carl shouting her name. Flames were already licking at the walls of the bakery below, the heat rising through the floorboards of their apartment with terrifying speed. "The stairs," Carl said, pulling her toward the window. "We have to go through the window." But even as they prepared to escape, Cheryl could see that the fire had spread too quickly, burned too hot for a simple accident. This was arson, she realized with horrible clarity, the final solution to Gregory Gonzalez's problem with their stubborn refusal to surrender. Carl helped her onto the roof, then turned back toward the apartment. "The lockbox," he said. "Our papers. The proof of our payments." "Carl, no!" Cheryl screamed, but he was already disappearing back through the window, back into the inferno that had been their home. She waited on the roof, the cold air burning her lungs as she called his name over and over. Minutes passed, each one an eternity, before she saw him stumble back toward the window, the metal lockbox clutched against his chest. But the flames had grown stronger, the heat more intense, and as he reached for the window frame, a section of the ceiling collapsed. The last thing Cheryl saw before the smoke overcame her was Carl's face, his eyes meeting hers through the chaos, his mouth forming the word love before the fire claimed him. She woke 3 days later in the home of Evelyn Myers, the town's doctor, her body wrapped in bandages and her heart shattered beyond repair. Frances Powell, the minister's wife, sat beside her bed, her kind face creased with sorrow. "I'm so sorry, dear," Frances whispered, taking Cheryl's bandaged hand. "Carl, he didn't make it out." The funeral was held on a gray morning when the wind cut through the cemetery like a blade. Most of the town attended, their faces reflecting the genuine grief of people who had lost not just neighbors, but friends. Tyler Peterson and Louis Reed were notably absent, having left Cedar Falls the morning after the fire with their business apparently concluded. But Kevin Morgan was there, standing at the back of the crowd, his hat in his hands and his face etched with something that might have been regret. Cheryl noticed him through her veil of grief, wondering who he was and why his presence felt significant in ways she couldn't understand. After the service, As the townspeople drifted away and Cheryl stood alone beside the fresh grave, Kevin approached. He moved carefully like a man aware that his presence might not be welcome. "Mrs. Miller," he said quietly, "I'm sorry for your loss." Cheryl looked up at him, taking in the weathered face and the scar that marked his left cheek. "Do I know you?" "No," Kevin replied, "but I knew your husband. Not personally, but I knew of him. He was a good man." Something in his voice made Cheryl study him more closely. There was pain there, and guilt, and a kind of desperate sincerity that suggested he was telling her something important without actually saying it. "Who are you?" she asked. Kevin was quiet for a long moment, looking down at Carl's grave. "Someone who should have done more to help," he said finally. "Someone who's going to make sure the people responsible for this pay for what they've done." Before Cheryl could respond, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the cemetery with more questions than answers. She had no way of knowing that Kevin Morgan had just made a promise that would cost him everything, that would transform him from Gregory Gonzalez's hired gun into the instrument of the man's destruction. The weeks following Carl's funeral passed in a haze of grief and practical necessities. The bakery was gone, reduced to a blackened shell that stood as a monument to everything Cheryl had lost. The insurance company, citing suspicious circumstances and unpaid premiums that Cheryl was certain they had kept current, refused to honor their policy. She found herself not only widowed but destitute, dependent on the charity of neighbors who had little enough to spare. Mary Myers, Evelyn's sister, offered Cheryl a room in her boarding house, a small space under the eaves that leaked when it rained, but provided shelter from the harsh winter wind. It was there, surrounded by her few salvaged possessions, that Cheryl began to piece together the truth about what had happened to her husband. The lockbox that Carl had died trying to save contained more than just their financial records. Hidden beneath the receipts and loan documents was a letter, partially burned but still legible, that changed everything Cheryl thought she knew about their situation. The letter was from Gregory Gonzalez, but it wasn't addressed to Carl. Instead, it was written to someone identified only as KM and contained detailed instructions about how to handle the Rivera problem. The language was carefully neutral, but the implication was clear. Carl's death had been no accident. "Encourage cooperation through appropriate means," the letter read. "If the baker proves intractable, more permanent solutions may be necessary. The property must be acquired by the first of the year." Cheryl's hands shook as she read the words again and again. Carl had been murdered, and she was holding proof of the conspiracy that had killed him. But proof meant nothing without someone willing to act on it, and she knew that the local sheriff, Gregory Gonzalez's cousin, would never investigate his relative's business practices. It was then that she remembered the stranger at the funeral, the man who had spoken of making people pay for what they had done. KM. Could those initials belong to him? And if so, was he part of the conspiracy that had destroyed her life? Or was he, as his words suggested, someone who regretted his role in the tragedy? The answer came 3 weeks later, on the night when Kevin Morgan appeared at her door with snow in his hair and desperation in his eyes. He had been drinking. She could smell it on him, but his words were clear and his purpose unmistakable. "I need to tell you the truth," he said, swaying slightly in the doorway. "About your husband, about the fire, about everything." Cheryl let him in, partly from curiosity and partly from the bone-deep loneliness that had consumed her since Carl's death. Kevin sat at her small table, his large hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she had made from her dwindling supplies. "My name is Kevin Morgan," he began. "I was hired by Gregory Gonzalez to make sure your husband didn't cause trouble over the loan. I was supposed to frighten him, make him understand that fighting was useless." Cheryl felt her heart stop. "You were part of it." "I was supposed to be," Kevin said, his voice heavy with self-loathing. "But I couldn't go through with it. I saw you and Carl together, saw what you had built, and I couldn't be the one to destroy it." "But someone did destroy it," Cheryl said, her voice rising. "Someone killed my husband and burned down our home." Kevin nodded, his face etched with pain. "Tyler Peterson. When I didn't do the job I was hired for, Gonzalez sent him to finish it. I tried to warn Carl, but I was too late." The silence that followed was filled with the weight of revelation and the sound of wind rattling the windows. Cheryl stared at the man across from her, trying to reconcile his apparent remorse with his admitted role in the conspiracy that had destroyed her life. "Why should I believe you?" she asked finally. Kevin reached into his coat and withdrew a bundle of papers. "Because I have evidence," he said. "Letters, financial records, proof of what Gonzalez has been doing to families all across the territory. Your husband wasn't his first victim, and he won't be his last unless someone stops him." Cheryl took the papers with trembling hands, scanning documents that revealed the scope of Gregory Gonzalez's predatory business practices. There were dozens of families, all trapped by loans that became impossible burdens, all losing their properties to manufactured defaults and legal technicalities. The pattern was clear and horrifying. Gonzalez would identify successful small businesses, offer seemingly generous loans, then manipulate the terms to force foreclosure. "He's been doing this for years," Kevin explained, "using men like me to intimidate borrowers, men like Tyler Peterson to handle the problems that couldn't be solved through fear alone." "And you were willing to be part of it," Cheryl said, her voice cold with accusation. Kevin flinched as if she had struck him. "Yes," he admitted, "I was. I told myself it was just business, that these people knew the risks when they borrowed money. I told myself a lot of things to make it easier to sleep at night." "What changed?" she asked. Kevin was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee as if it might contain answers to questions he didn't want to face. "You did," he said finally, "watching you and Carl, seeing what real happiness looked like. I realized I'd spent so many years destroying things that I'd forgotten what it felt like to want to protect something." Despite her anger and grief, Cheryl found herself moved by the raw honesty in his voice. This was a man wrestling with demons she could barely imagine, a man trying to find redemption in the ruins of his own making. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "Help me stop him," Kevin said, leaning forward with desperate intensity. "I have evidence, but I need someone with standing in the community, someone people will believe. Together we can expose what he's done, make sure he pays for Carl's death and all the others." Cheryl looked at the papers spread across her table, each one representing a family destroyed by Gregory Gonzalez's greed. She thought of Carl, of the dreams they had shared, and the future that had been stolen from them. She thought of the other wives who might be widowed, the other children who might be left fatherless if Gonzalez continued his predatory practices. "It's dangerous," Kevin warned. "Gonzalez has money and influence. He won't hesitate to eliminate threats to his business." "He already killed my husband," Cheryl replied, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her heart. "What more can he take from me?" But even as she spoke the words, she knew they weren't entirely true. Gonzalez could take her life, could silence her before she had a chance to seek justice for Carl. The thought should have terrified her, but instead it filled her with a cold determination she hadn't known she possessed. "There's something else," Kevin said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Something I haven't told you about the night of the fire." Cheryl's breath caught. "What?" "I was there," he admitted. "I saw Tyler Peterson and his men set the fire. I could have stopped them, should have stopped them, but I was a coward. I watched your home burn and did nothing." The confession hung between them like a physical presence. Cheryl felt a surge of rage so pure and hot that for a moment she couldn't speak. This man, this stranger who claimed to want to help her, had watched her husband die and done nothing to prevent it. "Get out," she whispered. "Cheryl, please." "Get out," she screamed, rising from her chair with such force that it toppled backward. "You watched him die. You could have saved him, and you did nothing." Kevin stood slowly, his face pale but resigned. "You're right," he said quietly. "I failed him, and I failed you. But Carl is dead, and nothing I do can change that. The question now is whether we're going to let his death mean something, or whether we're going to let Gonzalez continue destroying lives." He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the knob. "I'll be at the hotel for 3 more days," he said without turning around. "If you change your mind, if you decide that stopping Gonzalez is more important than punishing me, you know where to find me." The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Cheryl alone with her rage and her grief and the terrible weight of decision. For 2 days, Cheryl wrestled with the choice Kevin had laid before her. She walked the streets of Cedar Falls, seeing the town through new eyes, noticing the empty storefronts and the worried faces of business owners who might be Gregory Gonzalez's next targets. She visited Carl's grave, talking to the headstone as if her husband could somehow guide her through the moral maze she found herself trapped within. "What would you do?" she asked the cold marble. "Would you forgive him? Would you trust him?" But Carl's voice remained silent, leaving Cheryl to find her own way through the darkness. On the third day, she made her decision. It came not from forgiveness, which felt impossible, but from a recognition that her husband's death would be meaningless if she allowed Gregory Gonzalez to continue his predatory practices. Carl had died trying to protect their life together. Now she would live to protect others from suffering the same fate. She found Kevin at the hotel, sitting in the lobby with his belongings packed and ready for departure. He looked up as she approached, hope and resignation warring in his dark eyes. "I'll help you," she said without preamble. "Not because I forgive you, and not because I trust you, but because stopping Gonzalez is the right thing to do." Kevin nodded, understanding the conditions of their alliance. "What do you need from me?" "Everything," Cheryl replied. "Every document, every piece of evidence, every contact who might help us build a case. And I want to know exactly how we're going to make him pay." They spent the next several hours in Kevin's room, spreading papers across the bed and floor, mapping out Gregory Gonzalez's network of corruption and identifying the people who might be willing to testify against him. It was dangerous work. They both knew that Gonzalez had eyes and ears throughout the territory, that their investigation could be discovered at any moment. "There's a federal marshal named Christina Sanders," Kevin said, pointing to a name on his list of contacts. "She's been investigating territorial loan fraud for months. If we can get this evidence to her, she might be able to build a federal case." Cheryl looked up sharply. "Christina Sanders? The banker's wife?" Kevin frowned. "No, this Christina Sanders works out of the territorial capital. She's been using various covers to investigate financial crimes." The realization hit them both at the same time. The woman Cheryl had known as the banker's wife, the woman who had bought bread from their shop every morning, was actually a federal agent. She had been investigating Gregory Gonzalez all along, gathering evidence of his crimes while maintaining her cover as a respectable married woman. "She was protecting us," Cheryl whispered. "Or trying to." She knew what was happening. Kevin was already reaching for his coat. "We need to find her. If she's still in town, if her cover hasn't been blown, she might be our best chance at getting justice for Carl." But when they reached the boarding house where Christina Sanders had been staying, they found her room empty, her belongings gone. The landlady, a nervous woman named Frances Powell, wrung her hands as she explained that her tenant had left suddenly 3 days earlier, claiming urgent family business. "She seemed frightened," Frances added, "kept looking over her shoulder like someone was following her." Cheryl and Kevin exchanged grim looks. If Christina Sanders had been forced to flee, it meant that Gregory Gonzalez knew about the federal investigation. It meant they were running out of time, and possibly running out of allies. "What now?" Cheryl asked as they stood in the empty room. Kevin was quiet for a moment, staring out the window at the snow-covered street. "Now we take the fight to him," he said finally. "We go to the territorial capital and find Christina Sanders. We make sure this evidence reaches the right people, no matter what it costs." Cheryl nodded, feeling a mixture of fear and determination coursing through her veins. She was about to embark on a journey that would take her far from everything familiar into danger she could barely imagine. But for the first time since Carl's death, she felt as though she had a purpose, a reason to keep fighting. "When do we leave?" she asked. "Tonight," Kevin replied, "before Gonzalez realizes what we're planning." The journey to the territorial capital took 4 days through treacherous mountain passes and bitter winter weather. Cheryl and Kevin traveled separately, maintaining the pretense that they were strangers to avoid drawing attention from any of Gregory Gonzalez's associates who might be watching the roads. Cheryl rode in a supply wagon driven by Louis Reed, a grizzled prospector who asked no questions and accepted her modest payment without comment. She had told him she was visiting family, a lie that felt necessary given the circumstances. Kevin rode ahead on horseback, scouting the route and watching for signs of pursuit. On the second night, as they camped in a sheltered valley, Kevin brought disturbing news. "There are men following us," he reported quietly. 3 riders staying about a mile behind. They've been there since we left Cedar Falls. Cheryl felt her heart sink. Gonzalez's men? Most likely. Tyler Peterson and 2 others. Probably the same ones who set the fire. The knowledge that their enemies were so close filled Cheryl with a cold dread, but also with a fierce determination. These were the men who had killed her husband, who had destroyed her life and the lives of countless others. If they wanted to stop her from seeking justice, they would have to do more than simply follow her through the mountains. "What do we do?" she asked. Kevin was quiet for a moment, considering their options. "We could try to lose them in the passes ahead, but that's risky in this weather. Or what? Or we face them," Kevin said grimly. "End this here and now." Cheryl stared at him in the flickering firelight, seeing something hard and dangerous in his expression. This was the man Gregory Gonzalez had hired for his capacity for violence, she realized. This was the Kevin Morgan who had made his living through intimidation and force. "I won't run anymore," she said quietly. "Carl died because we tried to fight them legally, honorably. Maybe it's time to fight them on their own terms." Kevin nodded, understanding passing between them. "Tomorrow we reach Devil's Canyon. It's narrow with good cover on both sides. If we're going to make a stand, that's the place to do it." They spent the rest of the evening planning, going over every detail of the ambush they would set. It was strange, Cheryl thought, to be plotting violence with a man she had every reason to hate. But grief and desperation made for unlikely alliances, and she found herself trusting Kevin's expertise, even as she struggled with her feelings about his past. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with a sharp wind that cut through their clothes like a blade. As they approached Devil's Canyon, Kevin rode close to the supply wagon, his hand resting on the rifle across his saddle. "Remember," he said quietly to Cheryl, "when the shooting starts, stay down and don't move until I tell you it's safe." But Cheryl shook her head, pulling Carl's old hunting rifle from beneath the wagon's canvas cover. "I'm not hiding anymore," she said firmly. "These men killed my husband. I want them to see my face when they pay for it." Kevin looked as though he wanted to argue, but something in her expression stopped him. Instead, he nodded grimly and spurred his horse toward the rocks that lined the canyon walls. The ambush came sooner than expected. Tyler Peterson and his men had closed the distance during the night, and as the supply wagon entered the narrow canyon, they appeared on the rim above, their rifles already aimed at the travelers below. "Mrs. Miller," Tyler called down, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "You've led us quite a chase, but I'm afraid this is where your journey ends." The first shot shattered the morning silence, sending chips of rock flying from the canyon wall near Cheryl's head. She rolled from the wagon seat, taking cover behind the heavy wooden wheels as bullets whistled overhead. Lewis Reed, the wagon driver, cursed colorfully as he dove for his own shelter, his prospector's instincts serving him well in the sudden violence. From his position among the rocks, Kevin returned fire with deadly precision. His first shot took down one of Peterson's men, the impact spinning the gunman from his perch on the canyon rim. But Peterson and the remaining gunmen had good cover and better position, and their answering shots forced Kevin to duck behind the boulder that sheltered him. "You can't win this, Morgan," Peterson shouted down. "Mr. Gonzalez knows about your betrayal. He knows about the evidence you've stolen. Surrender now, and maybe we'll make it quick." Kevin's response was another carefully aimed shot that sent Peterson scrambling for better cover. But Cheryl could see that their situation was desperate. Peterson's men held the high ground, and it was only a matter of time before they worked their way around to a position where they could finish the job. It was then that Cheryl made a decision that would have horrified her just weeks earlier. Rising from behind the wagon wheel, she brought Carl's rifle to her shoulder and took aim at the canyon rim. The weapon felt strange in her hands, heavier than she remembered from the few times her husband had taken her hunting. But her purpose gave her strength. Her first shot went wide, but it served its purpose, drawing Peterson's attention and giving Kevin the opening he needed to change position. Her second shot was better, striking the rocks near the remaining gunman and forcing him to expose himself as he sought new cover. Kevin's rifle cracked again, and the gunman pitched forward, tumbling from the canyon rim to land with a sickening thud on the rocky floor below. That left only Tyler Peterson, trapped on the rim with nowhere to run and enemies on both sides. "It's over, Peterson," Kevin called up. "Throw down your weapon and we'll talk." But Peterson's response was a wild spray of bullets that ricocheted off the canyon walls, one of them striking the wagon's canvas cover and setting it smoldering. In his desperation, he had forgotten the most basic rule of canyon fighting. What goes up must come down, and bullets were no exception. The ricochet that ended Tyler Peterson's life came from his own rifle, the lead slug bouncing off 3 different rock faces before finding its way back to its source. He died instantly, his body joining those of his companions on the canyon floor. The silence that followed the gunfight was profound, broken only by the wind whistling through the rocks and the sound of Cheryl's ragged breathing. She stared at the rifle in her hands, hardly believing what she had done, what she had been capable of when pushed to the edge. Kevin emerged from his cover, moving carefully among the bodies to make sure the threat was truly ended. When he was satisfied that all 3 men were dead, he turned to Cheryl, who was still standing beside the wagon with the smoking rifle in her hands. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. Cheryl looked at him, then at the bodies scattered around the canyon floor. "I killed a man," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You defended yourself," Kevin corrected. "You did what you had to do to survive." But Cheryl shook her head, setting the rifle down with trembling hands. "Carl would never have wanted this. He believed in law and justice, not this." Kevin moved closer, his expression understanding. "Carl was a good man," he said quietly. "But good men don't always survive in a world where evil men make the rules. Sometimes you have to fight fire with fire." Lewis Reed emerged from his own shelter, surveying the carnage with the practical eye of a man who had seen violence before. "We need to move," he said bluntly. "Gunshots carry in these mountains, and there might be others coming." They reached the territorial capital 2 days later, their arrival marked by a mixture of relief and apprehension. The city was larger than anything Cheryl had ever seen, with paved streets and gas lamps and buildings that rose 3 and 4 stories into the sky. It was a place where federal marshals might actually have authority, where justice might be more than just a word used by men like Gregory Gonzalez to justify their crimes. Finding Christina Sanders proved easier than expected. The federal marshal maintained an office in the territorial courthouse, and when Cheryl and Kevin presented themselves with their evidence, she received them immediately. The woman Cheryl had known as a banker's wife was transformed in her official capacity, her demeanor professional, and her questions sharp and direct. "I've been building a case against Gregory Gonzalez for 8 months, she explained as she reviewed the documents they had brought. "But I needed evidence of direct criminal activity, proof that he was using violence and intimidation to collect on fraudulent debts." The papers Kevin had stolen provided exactly that evidence, documenting not just the loan fraud, but the network of hired guns and corrupt officials that made Gonzalez's operation possible. Combined with Christina's own investigation and the testimony of survivors like Cheryl, it would be enough to bring federal charges that could put Gonzalez away for life. "There's one problem," Christina continued. "Gonzalez has been alerted to our investigation. My sources tell me he's preparing to flee the territory, possibly as soon as tonight. If we're going to arrest him, it has to be now." The federal courthouse was a fortress of stone and iron, its halls echoing with the footsteps of lawmen and lawyers who represented a different kind of authority than the corrupt local officials Gregory Gonzalez had been bribing for years. As Cheryl waited in Christina's office while the marshal assembled her arrest team, she felt a strange mixture of anticipation and emptiness. This was what she had wanted, what she had risked everything to achieve. Justice for Carl, punishment for the men who had destroyed their life together. But now that it was within reach, she found herself thinking not of revenge, but of the future, of what she would do when this chapter of her life finally closed. Kevin sat across from her, his own thoughts clearly running in similar directions. The man who had been Gregory Gonzalez's enforcer was about to become the key witness in his former employer's downfall, a transformation that would require him to confront every choice he had made over the past several years. "What will you do?" Cheryl asked quietly. "When this is over?" Kevin was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," he admitted. I've spent so many years being the kind of man people fear that I'm not sure I remember how to be anything else. You could learn, Cheryl said, surprising herself with the gentleness in her voice. People can change if they really want to. Before Kevin could respond, Christina Sanders returned with news that would change everything. Gonzalez is gone, she announced grimly. He left the territory 3 hours ago, probably heading for Mexico, where federal warrants won't reach him. The words hit Cheryl like a physical blow. After everything they had endured, everything they had sacrificed, Gregory Gonzalez was going to escape justice. Carl's death would go unavenged, and the man responsible would live out his days in comfortable exile. There has to be something we can do, she said desperately. Christina shook her head. I'm sorry, Mrs. Miller. We have enough evidence to seize his assets, to compensate some of his victims, but the man himself is beyond our reach. It was Kevin who spoke into the crushing silence that followed. No, he said quietly, his voice carrying a certainty that made both women look at him sharply. He's not beyond reach. Not yet. The confrontation that would define the rest of Cheryl Miller's life took place not in a courtroom or a federal office, but in a small cantina on the Mexican side of the Rio Grande. Kevin Morgan had tracked Gregory Gonzalez there, using skills learned in years of hunting men who didn't want to be found, and Cheryl had insisted on accompanying him despite his protests about the danger. They found Gonzalez at a corner table, already deep into a bottle of tequila and apparently confident in his escape from American justice. He was a smaller man than Cheryl had expected, soft around the middle with pale hands and nervous eyes that darted constantly toward the cantina's exits. Kevin, he said with false joviality as they approached his table, I wondered when you'd turn up. And Mrs. Miller, isn't it? I'm sorry for your loss. The casual mention of Carl's death, delivered with such callous indifference, nearly broke Cheryl's composure. But she had come too far and endured too much to lose control now. You're going to pay for what you did, she said quietly. Gonzalez laughed, gesturing with his glass. Pay? My dear woman, I'm sitting in a country that doesn't recognize American warrants, with enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life. I'd say I've already paid the only price that matters. It was then that Kevin stepped forward, his hand moving with practiced speed to the gun at his hip. But instead of drawing the weapon, he placed a document on the table in front of Gonzalez, a paper that made the man's face go white with shock. What is this? Gonzalez whispered. A confession, Kevin replied, signed by Tyler Peterson before he died, detailing every crime you've committed over the past 5 years. Every murder, every case of arson, every family you've destroyed. Gonzalez's hands shook as he read the document, his confidence evaporating like smoke. Peterson never signed this. He's dead. Yes, he is, Kevin agreed, but not before he told me everything, hoping to save his own life. Amazing how talkative a man becomes when he's staring down the barrel of a rifle. The confession was a masterwork of fabrication, created by Kevin during their journey south and designed to look authentic enough to fool a man already rattled by his narrow escape from federal authorities. It contained details that only someone inside Gonzalez's organization could have known, mixed with enough genuine information to make it credible. This won't hold up in court, Gonzalez said, but his voice lacked conviction. It doesn't have to, Cheryl replied, taking the seat across from him, because you're not going to court. You're going to make this right. What followed was a negotiation unlike any that had taken place in the dusty cantina's history. Sitting across from the man who had destroyed her life, Cheryl Miller laid out terms that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Gonzalez would liquidate his remaining assets and use the proceeds to compensate his victims. He would provide detailed information about his criminal network, allowing federal authorities to arrest his remaining associates. And he would disappear permanently, never again to prey on honest families trying to build better lives. And if I refuse? Gonzalez asked. Kevin's smile was cold as winter wind. Then Mrs. Miller and I will make sure this confession reaches not just the federal marshals, but every newspaper between here and San Francisco. Your name will become synonymous with murder and theft. Every bounty hunter and lawman in the territory will be looking for you. You'll never be safe, Cheryl added. Never be able to trust anyone. Never be able to sleep peacefully. We'll make sure of that. The threat was delivered with such quiet certainty that Gonzalez seemed to age before their eyes. This was not the frightened widow he had expected to face, but a woman transformed by loss and hardened by necessity into someone capable of matching his own ruthlessness. In the end, Gregory Gonzalez signed the papers they had prepared, transferring ownership of properties and bank accounts that would provide some measure of justice for his victims. It wasn't perfect justice, wasn't the courtroom victory that Carl would have preferred, but it was something. It was enough. As they prepared to leave the cantina, Gonzalez made one final attempt to assert his authority. "You think you've won," he said bitterly, "but you're no different from me now. You've used threats and intimidation to get what you wanted." Cheryl paused at the door, looking back at the broken man who had cost her everything she held dear. "You're right," she said quietly. "I am different now. Carl's death changed me in ways I'm still discovering. But there's one crucial difference between us." "What's that?" "I'll be able to live with what I've done." The journey back to Cedar Falls took them through landscapes that seemed transformed by their experiences. The same mountains and valleys that had witnessed their desperate flight now bore witness to their return as different people, shaped by loss and hardened by necessity, but somehow stronger for having survived. Kevin had been quiet for most of the trip, wrestling with questions about his own future. The skills that had made him valuable to men like Gregory Gonzalez were not easily translated into legitimate pursuits, and he faced the challenge of rebuilding his life from the ground up. "What will you do now?" Cheryl asked as they crested the final ridge before Cedar Falls. Kevin was quiet for a long moment, looking down at the town that had become the scene of both their greatest failure and their ultimate redemption. "I thought I might stay," he said finally, "if you'll have me. The town needs someone to help rebuild, and I have experience with construction." It was a tentative offer, loaded with implications neither of them was quite ready to address directly. But Cheryl found herself nodding, recognizing that they had forged something in the crucible of their shared ordeal, something that might, with time and patience, grow into something more. "The bakery will need to be rebuilt," she said softly. "I could use a partner." As they rode down into Cedar Falls, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and for the first time since Carl's death, Cheryl Miller felt something that might eventually become hope. The future stretched before them, uncertain, but no longer empty, filled with possibilities that neither of them could have imagined when their paths first crossed in grief and desperation. Behind them, the mountains stood silent and eternal, keeping their secrets and bearing witness to the endless human capacity for both destruction and renewal. And in the growing dusk, the lights of Cedar Falls welcomed them home.